As if we needed any more indication from book one that it was time for Telemachus to grow up a little, it actually comes out of Athena's mouth in her disguise. She's standing next to him on page 87 and says, "You must not cling to your boyhood any longer. It's time you were a man." So Telemachus realizes it's time to change, something's got to give. It spurs him into his action, the failed attempt to rouse the suitors in his beginning of book 2, and then he gets ready to haul off on this tour with Mentor as his guide, Athena. And when he does head out on this tour, he's going to learn things. Travel is a way for him to gain knowledge. And in his tour around these great capitals in books 3 and 4, what Telemachus is really going to do is take a journey into a past. And this past is already something that has a kind of grandeur to it. He'll look at Pylos and this wonderful wealthy citadel of, that we see with Nestor. And then we're going to move on to Sparta and see Menelaus and Helen of Troy herself. We're going to see grand figures that are already of mythic proportion, according to how Telemachus marshals his engagement with them. I thought in making this turn to this grand past, such as we're going to see in 3 and 4, I might just toss up here a slide of a famous, probably our most famous ancient citadel from this time, the citadel of Mycenae, Agamemnon's palace. This is the so-called Lion Gate, and it has an air of majesty to it. And thinking back to the time when this was built, back in the first, early times, first millennium BCE, and even before, these citadels emerged up out of the plain around us, and at a time when there were simple agrarian folk in most parts of the world, there would be these grand citadels. And in the memory of time, as the citadels age and as history builds up around them and events take place that involve these places, eventually people start to think, my gosh, how in the world did they build those things anyway all those centuries ago? And when they did that, they started down a path of imagining that their ancestors were greater than they were. They even called these stones Cyclopean stones because they thought there was no way a human being could have moved them, and the kind of thing only a cyclops could move. So there was a kind of mythic orientation toward their deep past that the Greeks already had during Homer's time. The impulse here to look at your ancestors as being much greater than you were leads us to our first universal law in the course. I'm going to give you a few universal laws in the course. Guaranteed to be universal, money-back guarantee. And how much money do we pay for Coursera anyway? Universal laws are money-back guarantee. Universal law number 1, nostalgia is the most powerful force in the universe. When people are looking back to their past, they always imagine that it must have been better. It seems to be something that is exhibited across time, and surely the Greeks are susceptible to this sense of nostalgia as well. So Telemachus has his cue, it's time to go, and off he goes. He's going to visit 2 amazing places. Athena is going to bring him along. He's going to see Nestor's coastal city. And when he does, he's going to move from his edge of his island of Ithaca and have a trip down by boat to Pylos. Now remember, when he arrives by boat in Pylos, what does he see there on the shore? There are 9 divisions of 500 people each. So already we've got 4,500 people on a beach. That's probably going to arrest your attention. And now, in case we haven't got your attention, each of those groups of 500, each of those 9 groups of 500 is slaughtering 9 bulls. So we've got 81 bulls being slaughtered simultaneously on a beach. If that doesn't grab your attention, then you probably need some smelling salts. What Telemachus sees there absolutely is just extraordinary to him. The grandeur of this scene is something amazing. And the display of wealth. The conspicuous display of wealth. 81 bulls during Telemachus' time is a fortune to last, the equivalent of a fortune that could last a huge chunk of a lifetime. And yet here they are just being expended in this one event on the shores as he goes. So we know we're entering into a world of grandeur. Now, keeping in mind that this is a world of grandeur, we're always going to be remembering, although it's going to take Telemachus a little while to remember himself, that this should be the kind of grandeur that exists in his household. and instead these vagabonds are running riot across it. From Pylos, then we go overland over to Sparta, and at that point we're going to meet Menelaus, Agamemnon's very brother, and Helen of Troy, that face that launched 1,000 ships. We're going to have a private audience with her through Telemachus' eyes. We're going to see Helen. Now, through this trip, this traveling that Telemachus is going to do, it's a way for him to gain knowledge, and at the same time, he's mirroring, in a smaller, more controlled way, the kind of adventure that his father is on. For each of them, the experiential knowledge that's gained through traveling is something that's profound, that's powerful, that's life-shaping, that gives them tools and that allows them to advance in their own lives. Travel is a deeply powerful tool according to this scale of values. So as he gets ready to make his journey, makes his connection, gears up his boat, gets his provisions, makes his way to Pylos, sees this grandeur, he sits down and has his audience with Nestor. When he gets to Sparta, he'll sit down and have his audience with Menelaus and with Helen. Now, at each turn, the elders sit back and listen to Telemachus' version of events. And the first thing they do when they hear what's happening is to react the way, presumably, we're being taught a person should react. They don't just feel sorry for Telemachus. They don't pat him on the head and give him some Kleenex. They're angry. They're angry. The constant exhibition of Telemachus' elders after he tells them this story is to feel anger. We see this multiple times as the story is being told. Athena has already shown it. Page 85, as mentees, mentor, she is outraged, and she talks about how shameful this exhibition is. On page 134, we hear from Menelaus, we also hear from Nestor, that this is shameful, what's happening. Anger comes up when they hear this. The tour is partly an education for Telemachus to be schooled in how his emotions ought to be working. His emotions need some calibration. They need some changing. Oftentimes, I think we think that emotions are just kind of natural responses to things, and that just by nature you're going to feel things like embarrassment or anger or joy or whatever it is. But the stance that Homer is taking here in the Odyssey is a little bit different. It seems that Telemachus actually needs some schooling in this. There's an acculturation that he needs to do to know that it's right now to feel anger. That's the kind of emotional response he should be having. Each person he talks to expresses that. Then also at each turn, we hear a particular name that's brought up. When we're talking to Nestor on page 113, the name Orestes comes up. Athena, disguised as mentor on page 115, talks about Orestes. Menelaus, page 141, after hearing the story of what's happening in Telemachus' household, talks about Orestes. And in fact, casting our mind back for a second, back to book 1, Zeus, in his introductory remarks right at the very beginning, talks about Orestes, right on page 78 in the translation. At each point, the person who mentions Orestes is an older authority figure. They're reacting to this expression of powerlessness. In Zeus's case, it's the idea that people just toss up their hands and just feel like everything's fated and it's the god's fault. Instead, take action like that Orestes did. The mentor, Nestor and Menelaus, each after they hear the story that Telemachus tells and of his own pathetic powerlessness in this situation, say, "Oh, have you heard the one about Orestes?" Now, what are they referring to? What is this situation involving Orestes? Well, it just so happens that one of the famous stories of homecoming is something that's already percolating in the background of Homer's Odyssey. When Agamemnon famously makes his way home, he gets home pretty quickly. It's not a struggle for him to get a ship back to his citadel. But when he does, he sees his wife. "Hello, I'm back home." Doesn't realize that his wife has taken up a liaison with a lover, and that the two of them go ahead and murder Agamemnon shortly after he arrives. Now, this is an awful thing. Clytemnestra, Agamemnon's wife, and her lover kill the head of the household, Agamemnon, her husband. Now, it just so happens that within the Greek ethical code, if someone kills your father, as a son or a daughter, it is now your duty to kill your father's killer. Well, now what happens in Agamemnon's family? Agamemnon's own son and daughter are responsible now for taking revenge against his killer, which means, for them, killing their own mother. This is a nasty business. This is ugly and this is awful. In Homer's version of it, the part that's really emphasized is the lover part, Aegisthus. He's talked about as the one most responsible for the death of Agamemnon, so Orestes goes ahead and takes care of business and kills Aegisthus. But it's a messy story. It's already messy in Homer's time, and it's going to get even messier when we concentrate on it in our out weeks of the class. We're going to turn to, after we turn to classical Athenian tragedy, we're going to see the story of Agamemnon told through Aeschylus's eyes. My goodness, that's going to make our hairs curl. But when Homer focuses on it, what he means to point to is Orestes, in a situation that was very ugly and very nasty, he had the gumption to do what needed to be done, even in a situation where that was nasty, nasty business. Orestes did what needed to be done. Orestes and the story cycling around Agamemnon show up multiple times in Homer's Odyssey. And in relation to Telemachus, they always show up as this kind of coda that's placed on the end of Telemachus feeling sorry for himself. And the coda comes from from an older, more experienced person saying, you know what, even in the nasty business that poor Orestes had to take care of, his house was all messed up, and Orestes came in and took care of business. So when Telemachus is being schooled on how he should be reacting to the world, he's being introduced generally to the grand aristocratic world that is his birthright, that he ought to be enforcing to be his own on the island of Ithaca. He's being introduced to an emotional response. He's being acculturated to the right emotional response. Anger is what a person ought to feel when something as nasty as what's happening in your house is happening. Not pity, not sorry for yourself, not powerlessness. He's also being schooled in historical lessons by saying, look, if you're in this situation, you think you've got it bad, well, don't overlook what happened in a similar, in a situation that was surely as bad as yours, and probably much worse also. Orestes took care of business in his own situation. And you, as the son of a father who's being displaced by people that are eating you out of house and home, it's going to be incumbent upon you, they're hinting, to take action yourself. Go ahead and be the Orestes of your own story and take action. Now, in book 4, there's a wonderful scene that I just wanted to spend a little bit of time with. We get to, after we've had a chance to meet Nestor and his amazing display of wealth, we get a chance to see what's happening in the house of Menelaus. We also get to see that beautiful woman, Helen of Troy herself. She comes in and has an entrance into the story. We get to hear from her and hear her own story. When she does jump into the story, there are some interesting things for us to recognize. First of all, her beauty, her bewitching guile. It's extraordinary. It's obviously overwhelming. She is indeed the face that launches 1,000 ships. When we get to see her, she brings in a nice bowl for us to drink from that's going to soothe our pains as an alcoholic beverage. But she also adds to it something extra, something special. These are special drugs that she got on her sojourn in Egypt when she and Menelaus were blown off course. And these drugs she can now mix into wine that makes it into this wonderful potion where no one could feel any pain for having had it. The narcotic effect of the wine is another thing that seems to be hovering around the aura that is Helen. So in the case of Helen, we have beauty, we have magical power, we have intoxication, a little bit of danger as well, because she can bring you out of this world. All of these things together showing up in the figure of Helen. This is a cluster of ideas that we're going to see visited regularly in Homeric epic, of women who have power, who have a very clear erotic dimension to their power, who also are mixed up in the idea of magic, who have extraordinary beauty, and who, when they arrive in a room, room turn lots of heads. There's a tremendous power that Homer sees in this cluster of ideas, and we're going to see it represented in multiple places as our story moves forward. Not least when we turn to away from our story of Telemachus in the first 4 books of the Odyssey and move on to meet our hero, the man himself, the man this muse is singing of, Odysseus. He'll appear in our next lecture.